Mark leaned back in his leather chair, pen hovering over the termination letter. A slow chuckle escaped his lips as he signed his name with a flourish. "This is just business, Elaine," he said, sliding the paper across his mahogany desk. "Don't take it personal." I sat frozen, staring at the document that ended everything we'd built together. My hands trembled as I picked up the letter. 3 years of friendship, 2 years of partnership, and this was how it ended. "Sell your shares, Elaine," Mark continued, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You could even pay off your dad's house with what you'd get." The mention of my father's house hit like a slap. That house was all I had left of him. The house I'd mortgaged to fund Mark's dream. Our dream. "I'll sue you, Mark," I whispered, my voice barely audible. His laugh grew louder. "You should sell your shares then. You could use the cash, maybe even afford that lawsuit you're threatening." I stood up slowly, clutching the termination letter. The Mark I'd known in college, the one who'd held me when my father died, was gone. This stranger wearing his face had destroyed everything. I walked out silent, but not broken. 3 years earlier, I was just another freshman struggling through bio class at Florida State. That's where I first saw Mark Luiz, hunched over his textbook in the front row, frantically taking notes. He was different from the other students. While they complained about assignments, Mark absorbed every word. His clothes were worn but clean, his backpack held together with duct tape. I learned later he was there on a full scholarship, the first in his family to attend college. I sat behind him for weeks, watching him excel at everything. When our professor assigned lab partners, I gathered enough courage to ask him. He looked surprised that someone wanted to work with him. "Sure," he said, his face lighting up. "I'm Mark." "Elaine," I replied, shaking his calloused hand. We made a good team. I was organized and detail-oriented, while Mark had this incredible ability to see patterns others missed. Our first project earned the highest grade in class. After class, Mark walked me to the parking lot. He stopped when he saw my car. Nothing fancy but reliable. "Must be nice," he said quietly. I realized then how different our worlds were. But something about his determination drew me in. He wasn't bitter about his circumstances. He was driven by them. 2 months into sophomore year, everything changed. Dad was driving home from work when a drunk driver ran a red light. The call came at 2 a.m. I remember dropping the phone, the sound echoing through my dorm room. Mark found me in the hospital waiting room 12 hours later. I don't know how he knew, but he was there. No words, just his presence as I cried into his shoulder. The funeral was small. Dad's coworkers, a few neighbors, and Mark. He stayed by my side through everything. The burial, the lawyers, the endless paperwork that comes with losing someone. "He was proud of you," Mark said one evening as we sat in Dad's empty house. "He talked about you all the time at the hardware store." I nodded, unable to speak. Dad had worked double shifts to pay for my college. Now the house felt too big, too quiet. "You don't have to go through this alone," Mark added. "I'm here." Those words meant everything. In the space of a week, I'd lost my father, but gained something I'd never had before. A brother. Mark wasn't just my study partner anymore. He was family. The house was worth around $300,000, paid off completely. Dad's final gift to secure my future. Junior year, Mark started talking about artificial intelligence, not just as a class topic, but as something that could change everything. He'd sketched diagrams on napkins during lunch, explaining how computers could learn human behavior. "Imagine an AI that could scan your body," he said one afternoon, his eyes bright with excitement. "It could analyze your fitness level, your goals, everything. Then it would create a perfect workout plan just for you." I watched him draw stick figures doing exercises, arrows pointing to muscles, equations I couldn't understand. "It could even watch your form while you exercise," he continued. "Tell you in real time how to improve. No more guessing, no more injuries from bad technique." The idea was brilliant. Mark had identified a real problem. People wanted to get fit, but didn't know how to do it safely or effectively. "What would you call it?" I asked. "Body goals," he said without hesitation. "Because it helps people reach their body goals." I could see it clearly, an app that made personal training accessible to everyone. Mark had the technical skills to build the AI, and I could handle the business side. This could really work, I told him. Mark grinned. "If I ever build something real, I want you by my side." I smiled back, not knowing those words would haunt me later. Building body goals required more money than 2 college students had. The AI needed powerful servers to process body scans and analyze movement patterns. Mark estimated we needed at least $200,000 to launch properly. I stared at the bank statement showing my inheritance. Dad's house could provide exactly what we needed, but it meant mortgaging the only thing I had left of him. "I can't ask you to do this," Mark said when I suggested it. "That's your father's house." "Dad always said education was the best investment," I replied. "This feels like something he'd support." We sat in the kitchen where Dad used to read his morning paper. The decision felt huge, but right. "If we do this, we split everything 50-50, Mark insisted. I shook my head. "You created body goals. You deserve more. Take 55%. "Elaine, it's your brain behind this, Mark. I'm just helping make it real." He tried to argue, but I was firm. Mark was the genius. I was just the funding. At the bank, I signed papers that would haunt me for years. The mortgage broker smiled as I wrote the check for $200,000. Mark stared at the check, his hands shaking slightly. "I won't let you down." I believed him completely. Body goals exploded faster than we'd imagined. Within 6 months, we had thousands of users scanning their bodies and following AI-generated workout plans. Fitness influencers started promoting us on social media. Tech blogs called us revolutionary. Mark worked 18-hour days coding new features. I handled contracts, marketing, and finances from my dorm room. We were making money, real money. "We need to move to Silicon Valley," Mark said during one of our weekly video calls. "The investors are all out there, the talent, the connections." He was right. Florida was great for starting, but scaling required being where the tech world lived. We found office space in Palo Alto that cost more per month than most people's salaries. The move meant Mark would drop out of school to run the company full-time. I wanted to join him, but I'd made a promise to Dad. I had 2 years left on my degree. "I'll graduate first," I told Mark. "Then I'll move out there permanently." "But you're missing everything," he protested. "The investor meetings, the partnerships." "I'll visit every month," I promised, "and I can handle the business side remotely." Mark looked disappointed but nodded. I didn't realize then how dangerous those 2 years apart would be. Flying to Palo Alto every month felt like visiting another world. Our office buzzed with energy. Developers hunched over computers, sales calls happening in glass conference rooms, whiteboards covered with growth charts. Mark had hired aggressively. Body Goals now employed 23 people, all brilliant, all dedicated. I felt proud walking through the office, knowing my father's house had made this possible. "You need to meet Dustin and Sean," Mark said during my October visit. "They're heading up business development." Dustin Parker was polished in that Silicon Valley way. Expensive jeans, designer sneakers, perfect teeth. Sean Napier was quieter, but equally sharp, with the kind of confidence that came from previous startup success. "So you're the famous Elaine," Dustin said, his handshake firm. "Mark talks about you constantly." Sean nodded approvingly. The CFO who funded everything from across the country, impressive. Something in their tone felt off, like they were humoring me. When I mentioned strategic decisions I'd made remotely, they exchanged glances. "Remote work is challenging," Sean said carefully. "Hard to stay connected to the pulse." After that meeting, I noticed Mark seemed different around them. More formal, less like the friend I'd known in college. When I brought it up, he brushed off my concerns. "They're helping us grow faster than ever," he said. During my December visit, Mark handed me a stack of legal documents. "Standard incorporation cleanup," he explained casually. "Everyone's signing. Lawyers say it'll protect us better as we scale." The paperwork was thick, full of legal jargon I didn't fully understand. Mark seemed relaxed about it, so I trusted his judgment. "What exactly does this change?" I asked. "Nothing major," Mark said. "Just reorganizing from the Florida LLC to a Delaware corporation. Better for investors." I flipped through pages of shareholder agreements and transfer documents. My name appeared throughout, but the percentages were confusing. "The lawyers explained everything to me," Mark continued. "It's all standard stuff." Dustin appeared in the doorway. "Everyone ready to sign? Legal wants these back today." I looked at Mark one more time. He nodded encouragingly. I signed where the yellow sticky notes indicated, trusting the person I'd trusted with everything. Great, Dustin said, collecting the papers. This clears up so many complications. As he left, I caught him sending a quick text. She signed. Time to move. I thought I'd misread it. Mark was chatting about dinner plans, completely normal. But something cold settled in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't shake. The paperwork disappeared into Dustin's briefcase, and with it, my future. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in February. Updated cap table attached, the subject line read. I opened it while eating breakfast in my dorm, expecting routine quarterly updates. My heart stopped. According to the document, I now own 0.48% of the Body Goals Inc., not 45%, not even 4.5%. Less than 0.5% of the company I'd mortgaged my father's house to fund. I called Mark immediately. There's a mistake in the cap table, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It shows I only own. It's not a mistake, Mark interrupted. We had to issue new shares for the Delaware Incorporation. Everyone got diluted. But from 45% to less than 1%, I diluted myself too, he said, his tone defensive. I'm down to 40%, don't be dramatic. Dramatic? I'd lost essentially everything while he'd lost almost nothing. The math was brutal and obvious. You should have asked me first, I said. You signed the paperwork, Elaine. The lawyers explained the dilution clauses. But they hadn't explained anything to me. Mark had said it was routine cleanup. This isn't what we agreed to, I whispered. Things change, Mark replied coldly. Companies evolve. You weren't here for the growth, so you don't get the rewards. The line went dead. I stared at my phone for 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Mark, my closest friend, had essentially stolen my company from me. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial loss. I called our lawyer from the early days, but he explained his hands were tied. You signed valid legal documents, he said. The dilution was disclosed in the shareholder agreement, but I didn't understand what I was signing. Legally, that's your responsibility. I'm sorry, Elaine. I hung up and cried for the first time since Dad's funeral. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed was gone. The house Dad left me was mortgaged for a company that no longer wanted me. My next call was to Mark again. This time he answered on the first ring. We need to talk in person, I said. I'm busy this week, he replied. Can we do a video call? No, Mark. I'm flying out there tomorrow. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he sighed. Fine, but this won't change anything. I booked a red-eye flight with my credit card, using money I couldn't afford to spend. The 6-hour flight felt like the longest of my life. When I landed in San Francisco, I knew this conversation would determine everything. Mark's office had gotten bigger since my last visit. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Bay Area, and his desk looked like it cost more than most cars. Success had changed him in ways I was only beginning to understand. You weren't here, he said before I could even sit down. You didn't land our biggest ad deals. You didn't build the core algorithms. I funded everything, I replied, struggling to keep my voice level. I handled the business operations remotely. Anyone can write a check, Elaine. Building a company takes vision. The cruelty in his voice was shocking. This wasn't the Mark who'd comforted me after Dad's death. I mortgaged my father's house for you, I said. And you got paid back through your shares. You're still making money. 0.48% of what I earned. Mark leaned back in his chair, completely calm. This was always my company. You just brought cash. Those words hit like physical blows. I'd been demoted from co-founder to investor, from partner to employee. Am I still considered a founder? I asked quietly. Mark paused, considering his words carefully. You were, now you're just a shareholder. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. After everything we've been through, business is business, he said with a shrug. I walked toward the door, then turned back. You used to be better than this. Mark didn't respond. 2 days later, a courier knocked on my dorm room door. The envelope contained official termination paperwork, effective immediately. According to the letter, my consulting arrangement with the Body Goals Inc. was being terminated due to evolving business needs. I wasn't even considered an employee anymore. Just a consultant who could be dismissed at will. The letter was signed by Luiz, CEO. His signature looked bolder than I remembered, more confident. Below it was a handwritten note. Clean break is better for everyone, M. My phone rang an hour later. Mark's voice was cheerful, almost friendly. Did you get the paperwork? He asked. You fired me, I said numbly. Technically, we ended your consulting agreement. It's different. How is it different? Consultants don't get unemployment benefits, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Sell your shares, Elaine. You could even pay off your dad's house. The mention of my father's house again made my blood boil. That house represented everything Dad had worked for, everything I'd sacrificed. I'll sue you, Mark, I said quietly. His laugh was cold and calculating. You should sell your shares then. You could use the cash, maybe even afford that lawsuit you're threatening. The line went dead. I sat in my empty dorm room, holding the termination letter, and made a decision that would change everything. Finding a lawyer who would take my case wasn't easy. Most Silicon Valley attorneys were already representing tech companies and wouldn't risk conflicts of interest. The few who'd consider it wanted $50,000 up front. Finally, I found Patricia Wexler, a former corporate lawyer who'd started her own practice representing startup employees. She agreed to take the case on contingency after reviewing my documentation. You have a strong case for breach of fiduciary duty, she said during our first meeting. The dilution without proper consent is problematic. What are my chances? Honestly, 50-50. They have expensive lawyers and a good narrative, but the facts are on your side. I signed the representation agreement with shaking hands. A week later, we filed a lawsuit against the Body Goals Inc., Mark Luiz, Dustin Parker, and Sean Napier for breach of fiduciary duty, wrongful termination, and misrepresentation. The response came faster than expected. The Body Goals Inc. filed a countersuit, accusing me of reputational harm, interference with business relationships, and frivolous litigation. They're trying to intimidate you, Patricia explained. Standard practice. They want you to back down. Will I? She smiled grimly. That depends on how much fight you have left. I thought about my father, about the promises I'd made to him and to myself. I have plenty. The tech blogs picked up the story within days, but their version painted me as the villain. Disgruntled ex-employee sues rising startup, read the headline on TechCrunch. The article described me as a former consultant who provided early funding, but made no mention of my co-founder status. Sources close to Body Goals described the lawsuit as meritless. The article continued. The plaintiff appears to be seeking attention and financial gain from a company she had minimal involvement in building. Other publications followed with similar coverage. I was portrayed as emotional, vengeful, and unstable. One blogger called me another example of why startups should avoid taking money from friends. My law school advisor emailed me the day after the TechCrunch article. Are you okay? This could hurt your bar admission chances. I hadn't considered that possibility. Bar examiners looked closely at character and fitness. A public lawsuit, even a justified one, could derail my legal career before it started. Patricia tried to reassure me. The truth will come out in court. Don't let the media narrative discourage you. But reading those articles hurt more than I'd expected. Mark's team was controlling the story, making me invisible, just like they'd made me invisible in the company. They're betting you'll quit, Patricia said. Will you? I gritted my teeth. Never. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when trial began. Mark walked up them like he was attending a movie premiere, waving and smiling for cameras. Dustin and Sean flanked him, all three wearing identical navy suits. I climbed the same steps alone, trying to ignore the flashing cameras and shouted questions. Inside, the courtroom felt massive and intimidating. Judge Wilson was older, probably close to retirement, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She'd seen thousands of cases like this and seemed unmoved by the media attention. Mark's legal team was led by Harrison Blake, a partner at one of San Francisco's most prestigious firms. His opening statement was polished and compelling. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Blake began, this case is about a business relationship that soured and a former consultant who refuses to accept that her role was limited. He painted Mark as a visionary entrepreneur who'd built Body Goals from nothing. I was described as a well-meaning friend who provided early capital but lacked the skills to contribute meaningfully to the company's growth. When Patricia stood for our opening, the contrast was stark. She was competent, but clearly outgunned by Blake's team and resources. The evidence will show that Elaine Elliot was deliberately deceived And defrauded, she said simply. The jury looked skeptical. When I took the stand, Blake's cross-examination was brutal. He made every decision I'd made seem naive or irrelevant. Miss Elliot, you claim to be a co-founder of Body Goals. Can you tell us what specific code you wrote? I handled the business side. So you wrote no code. What about the AI algorithms that power the app? Mark developed those, but So you developed no core technology. What major clients did you personally recruit? I managed our financial operations and... That's not what I asked. How many major clients did you personally bring to the company? Blake continued this pattern for hours, making me seem like a glorified accountant rather than a co-founder. Every answer I gave was twisted to support their narrative. You mortgaged your father's house to invest in Body Goals, correct? Yes. So you made a financial investment, just like any other investor might do? It was different than that. Please answer yes or no. You made a financial investment, yes, but thank you. No further questions. I left the stand feeling humiliated. Patricia tried to rebuild my credibility on redirect, but the damage was done. Dustin's testimony was devastating. He was polished, confident, and completely believable as he described my limited role in the company. Elaine was passionate about Body Goals, he said, looking directly at the jury. But passion doesn't qualify someone to run a high-growth technology company. Blake walked him through examples of strategic decisions made without my input, meetings I hadn't attended, and deals I hadn't negotiated. In your professional opinion, was Miss Elliot operating as a co-founder during the period you observed? No, Dustin said firmly. She was more like support staff. Valuable support staff, but not executive leadership. The jury nodded along with his testimony. He seemed credible, reasonable, and unbiased. Patricia's cross-examination barely dented his story. Dustin had been coached well and stuck to his narrative. Mr. Parker, are you aware that Miss Elliot mortgaged her family home to fund the company? Yes, and we're grateful for her early investment. Investment, not founding contribution? I consider it an investment, yes. Sean's testimony followed the same pattern. Both men portrayed me as an early investor who'd exaggerated her role in the company's development. By the end of the week, I felt completely defeated. Their version of events sounded more convincing than the truth. Unless we get something big, we're losing, Patricia whispered during a brief recess. The jury's body language was clear. They believed Mark's team. That afternoon, Blake offered a settlement. $50,000 in exchange for dropping the lawsuit and signing a non-disclosure agreement. It's insulting, I told Patricia. But maybe it's better than losing everything. It's your decision, she said. But think carefully. This might be your only chance to get something. I spent the entire night walking around the city, trying to decide. $50,000 would cover my legal fees and not much else. But losing at trial meant getting nothing and owing Patricia's costs. The next morning, I met Patricia at a coffee shop near the courthouse. I'd rather starve, I said firmly. Let them take everything, but I'm not walking away like I was never there. Patricia smiled for the first time in weeks. Good, I was hoping you'd say that. That afternoon, Mark appeared on CNBC's Closing Bell show. The host introduced him as a solo genius who built Body Goals from scratch. Watching him take credit for everything we'd built together broke something inside me. But it also steeled my resolve. We were going to fight this to the end. During my final day of testimony, the pressure finally broke me. Blake had been hammering away for hours, making me repeat painful details about my father's death and my financial decisions. So you invested your inheritance in a risky startup, he said. That was your choice, wasn't it? Yes, I whispered. And when that investment didn't pay off as you'd hoped, you decided to blame my client? No, that's not. Miss Elliot, isn't it true that you're simply a disappointed investor who can't accept that business involves risk? The combination of exhaustion and humiliation finally overwhelmed me. Tears started flowing, and I couldn't stop them. I just wanted him to keep his promises, I said, my voice breaking. Blake pressed harder. What promises? Show me a written contract guaranteeing your ownership percentage. I couldn't. Everything had been based on trust and friendship. Across the courtroom, Mark was watching my breakdown with undisguised satisfaction. He thought it was over. But as I wiped my eyes, I noticed something strange. Dustin was glaring at Sean during a sidebar conversation, his face flushed with anger. Something was happening between them, and Mark seemed oblivious to it. During lunch break, I followed Dustin and Mark to a restaurant across from the courthouse. They sat in a corner booth, and their conversation quickly escalated into an argument. 1%? Dustin's voice carried across the restaurant. I planned this whole thing with you, and I get 1 lousy percent while Sean gets 7? Mark leaned forward, his voice lower but still audible. Keep your voice down. Sean brought strategic value. Strategic value? What did he do that I didn't? Sean gave me the idea for the Delaware Incorporation. You were just execution. Dustin's face turned red. So I'm what, your puppet? You were always the fall guy, Mark said coldly. If this ship sinks, it's on you. Dustin stood up abruptly, throwing his napkin on the table. We'll see about that. He stormed out of the restaurant without looking back. Mark sat alone, checking his phone like nothing had happened. I walked back to the courthouse with my heart pounding. Something had just shifted in Mark's perfect plan. That evening, as I sat in my hotel room reviewing testimony notes, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Check your email. I suggest you use this before I change my mind. My hands shook as I opened my laptop. The email contained a single attachment, a PDF of an internal Slack conversation thread. The timestamp showed it was from 6 months ago, right around when I'd signed the Delaware Incorporation papers. I read through the messages with growing shock. Mark, everything ready for the Elaine situation? Sean, dilution paperwork is set. She'll go from 45% to under 1%. Think she'll figure it out? She's too loyal to read the fine print. Plus, she trusts Mark completely. Perfect. Once this is done, we can move forward without dead weight. What if she lawyers up? With what money? She'll have to sell her shares to afford an attorney. And even if she does, who's going to believe her over us? The conversation continued for pages, laying out their entire plan to deceive me. They'd deliberately crafted the paperwork to hide the dilution, knowing I trusted Mark enough not to question it. The most damning message came from Sean. She mortgaged her daddy's house for this. Going to be awkward when she realizes daddy's money bought her nothing. Mark had responded with a laughing emoji. I printed the entire conversation, my hands shaking with rage and vindication. Finally, I had proof of what they'd done to me. The next morning, I handed the papers to Patricia with trembling fingers. Where did you get this? She asked. Does it matter? She smiled grimly. Not even a little bit. Your Honor, we'd like to introduce Exhibit H, Patricia announced the next morning. Blake shot to his feet. Objection, we haven't seen this evidence. It was just obtained, Your Honor, Patricia replied, and it's directly relevant to the defendant's state of mind. Judge Wilson examined the papers carefully. I'll allow it, but counsel may examine the evidence before cross-examination. Patricia handed copies to the jury and began reading excerpts aloud. The courtroom fell completely silent as the conspiracy unfolded in Mark's own words. She's too loyal to read the fine print, Patricia read. Plus she trusts Mark completely. I watched Mark's face turn pale. Dustin stared at his hands. Sean scribbled notes frantically, probably trying to figure out how to explain this away. Blake was whispering urgently with his team, but there was no good explanation for what the jury had just heard. She mortgaged her daddy's house for this, Patricia continued. Going to be awkward when she realizes daddy's money bought her nothing. Several jury members visibly recoiled at that line. The casual cruelty was undeniable. Your Honor, Patricia said, this evidence clearly shows a deliberate conspiracy to defraud my client of her rightful ownership in the company she helped found. The judge paused for a long moment. Is this evidence authentic, counsel? We're prepared to verify its authenticity through digital forensics, Your Honor. Judge Wilson nodded slowly. This court will recess while the defense examines this new evidence. During the recess, I could hear Blake's team arguing in the hallway. Their confident demeanor had completely evaporated. The media exploded within hours. Someone had leaked portions of the Slack conversation to TechCrunch, and suddenly, the narrative flipped completely. Betrayal, how Body Goals founders conspired to steal from their partner, read the new headline. The article included quotes from the conversation and painted me as the victim of an elaborate scheme. My phone rang constantly with interview requests. Other tech blogs picked up the story, each adding more details about the betrayal. VC investors distanced themselves from body goals following fraud revelations, appeared on Business Insider. Several major investors had apparently suspended funding discussions. Sean resigned that afternoon, citing personal reasons. His departure only made the company look more guilty. By evening, Mark's lawyers had filed an emergency motion to settle the case out of court. "They're panicking," Patricia told me over dinner. "This evidence changes everything. What happens now? Now we wait for the judge's ruling. But Elaine, I think we're going to win." For the first time in months, I felt hope. Judge Wilson took 3 days to issue her ruling. When court reconvened, the room was packed with reporters, investors, and tech industry observers. "This court has carefully reviewed all evidence presented," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. The Slack conversation, introduced as Exhibit H, demonstrates a clear pattern of deceptive conduct by the defendants. Mark's team sat rigidly in their chairs. The evidence shows that Miss Elliot was deliberately misled about the nature and consequences of the Delaware incorporation documents. The defendants conspired to dilute her ownership through fraud and misrepresentation. I could barely breathe as she continued. "This court finds that Miss Elliott's original 45% ownership stake should be restored along with her status as co-founder of the Body Goals, Inc." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Mark stared straight ahead, his face completely blank. "Furthermore," Judge Wilson continued, "Miss Elliot is awarded damages in the amount of $3.2 million for lost wages and compensation during the period of her wrongful exclusion." Patricia squeezed my hand under the table. The judge turned to look directly at Mark. "Mr. Luiz, you mocked Miss Elliot while signing her termination letter. You told her to sell her shares to afford a lawsuit. I hope you're prepared for her to sign your termination papers now." The gavel came down with finality. 2 weeks later, I stood in the Body Goals office as the majority shareholder. The same conference room where Mark had fired me was now hosting a very different kind of meeting. "Effective immediately, I'm assuming the role of CEO," I announced to the assembled staff. "Mark Luiz will transition to an advisory role with no voting rights." Mark sat at the far end of the table, no longer the confident entrepreneur who'd built an empire on my father's sacrifice. Dustin was gone, having resigned in shame. Most of the original team remained, looking nervous but hopeful. "I want everyone to know that your jobs are secure," I continued. "We're going to rebuild this company on principles of honesty and fairness." After the meeting, I walked to what was now my office. The nameplate on the door read, "Elaine Elliot, co-founder and CEO." I graduated from law school the following month, using my settlement money to pay off my father's house in full. The mortgage that had started this whole journey was finally gone. Standing alone in my new office, I thought about Dad. He'd worked double shifts to give me opportunities, never knowing his sacrifice would eventually lead to this moment. Mark had been wrong about one thing. This was never just his company. It was built on my father's legacy, my friendship, and my belief in doing the right thing. Now it would be run the same way.